Should monastics make a mistake in a psalm, responsory, refrain, or reading, they must make satisfaction there before all. If they do not use this occasion to humble themselves, they will be subjected to more severe punishment for failing to correct by humility the wrong committed through negligence. Youth, however, are to be whipped for such a fault. It is certainly the case that everyone makes mistakes. This is just what it means to be human in a lot of ways. But there is a special attention given to when one is particularly making a mistake in the oratory. Now, this is, again, the point in time where people are reading or singing or doing something in the prayer service that involves a mistake. Now, it's one of those deals where too much of a one-to-one comparison to this simply can yield perhaps not the intention of what Benedict is writing here. Again, the corporal punishment aspects of St. Benedict's rule are certainly in the 500s something applicable, but not nearly as applicable for us in the 21st century. But the point is that what Benedict always is asking us to be is attentive. Being fully attentive and present to what we are doing. Insofar as we make mistakes due to our inattentiveness, we are in danger of losing the whole thing. We have to make satisfaction, as he says, through humility, but if we don't, then are we really there present, and are we really there with our minds and hearts in there at all? To put it the way that Sister Joan puts it, if we pray prayers and read scripture and never think about the implications of that prayer or think about the interpretations of those scriptures, are we really immersing ourselves in that life at all? Are we simply going through the motions inattentively? Benedict never wants this to be the case. And again, it should be noted that Benedict understands that mistakes will be made. He understands that that's simply going to be the case. But the point is that if we refuse to amend from our mistakes, in other words, like he says, by the act of humility, then we once again are doubly at fault, because we are both making perhaps an inattentive mistake, but also are giving way to our pride and not mortifying it by our humility. To make a mistake and to be inattentive is for Benedict to be on the ledge of falling into temptation and into sin. For Benedict, inattentiveness is what we have to, at the very outset, get rid of and try to be as attentive as possible to what we do when we are speaking, saying, reading in the oratory, but also, if we should make a mistake, to still be able to practice that humility that drives out pride. If monastics commit a fault while at any work, while serving in the kitchen, in the storeroom, in serving, in the bakery, in the garden, in any craft, or anywhere else, either by breaking or losing something, or failing in any other way in any other place, they must at once come before the prioress and abbot and community of their own accord, admit their fault, and make satisfaction. If it is made known through another, they are to be subjected to a more severe correction. When the cause of the sin lies hidden in the conscience, the monastic is to reveal it only to the prioress or abbot or to one of the spiritual elders, who know how to heal their own wounds as well as those of others, without exposing them and making them public. It's very easy to interpret this chapter as simply punishment for mistakes that are made. It's easy to perhaps read this in sort of a draconian sense, that any little mistake requires punishment and satisfaction. But if we read a little bit deeper, you'll find that instead, Benedict once again is asking the community to be completely self-aware in the ways in which it is operating. And in this particular way, there is nothing within the monastery that is unimportant. There's no little bit that needs to be left unattended or inattentive, as that word kind of derives from. And so when we think about when Benedict says, if there's a fault that happens, then it needs to be said to the prioress or abbot, we need to also keep in mind that this is also a responsibility by the person who commits the fault. And perhaps the fault is as simple as a plate gets broken in the kitchen. Well, that kitchen plate is in service of something. It's not simply an item that needs to be replaced at the supermarket. Remember, this is the 500s. This is not the 21st century where we run down to Walmart and grab a new one and it's not a big deal. Rather, it's the community's property. Remember that no monastic owns any of this. It is held in the service of the monastery, but it's never anybody's owned item. Remember the chapter over ownership, that not even a pen or tablet is something that someone can claim private ownership over, but rather the breaking of this plate is something that affects the whole community. It's something that the absence of is felt whenever we get ready to have a meal together. And that this is not simply something that Benedict is simply doling out punishment for, but rather this is something that needs to be put in front of the person, and this affects the whole community. But that second part of which, if there is something else going on that needs to be gently taken care of, let's say that plate gets broken, but there is something else going on in the circumstance. The person who makes the fault that accidentally breaks the plate is having a particularly difficult time with, let's say, one of the members of the community. And that member of the community just so happens to be on kitchen duty with them that week, and that at that particular moment where they just could not stand the person anymore, there was perhaps some ill words shared between them. Now, this, again, shows that Benedict primarily is concerned with one's soul. The fault that occurs is, as Benedict would say, deeply connected to the relationship in the community. And as the person might come forward to the elder or the prioress or abbot and admit the fault, but also be able to have the confidence that they can say, I particularly was having a problem with my community member, and that I was given over to anger at that point. Well, guess what? The abbot or prioress is actually instructed in other places that, no, we deal with this gently. We both recognize that, of course, the person recognizes that their fault was due to the sin of anger. They actually readily admit that to the prioress or abbot, but then the abbot or prioress is not just going to go blab to everybody about this, but instead, what does the prioress or abbot or elder do? Well, what they can do is say, well, if there is particular animosity or enmity between members, then practically let's not have those two members share the kitchen for a while. Let's have one of them be involved in some other business of the monastery. Let's have them not necessarily have to work together if there's going to be an agitation towards sin. And then we will then deal with the spiritual matter in a way that is private, that's not going to be open sore to the community, that we begin to spread rumors, or we begin to encourage people to think lesser of these two people who might be quarreling. Because guess what? Everybody quarrels with other people of different personalities. But that care that Benedict shows is that this is not about fault correcting and fault punishment. This is also about community responsibility, and that all of these things have deep spiritual import to them that have to be dealt with very gently. There's not simply this, you messed up and I don't care if you were mad at someone else, you need to fix that yourself. In fact, Benedict lays this at the prioress or abbot or elder's feet and says, hey, this is something that's going on. This requires some very careful attentiveness and very gentle dealings with, because this has to do with the cure of souls. We are, in a way, trying to, as best as we can, live holy lives together, but also that holiness requires us to have a gentle touch whenever things like this in the community happen. It is the responsibility of the abbot and prioress to announce day and night the hour for the Opus Dei. They may do so personally or delegate the responsibility to a conscientious member so that everything may be done at the proper time. Only those so authorized are to lead psalms and refrains after the prioress or abbot according to their rank. No monastics should presume to read or sing unless they are able to benefit the hearers. Let this be done with humility, seriousness, and reverence, and at the bidding of the prioress or abbot. If you ever travel or see pictures of monasteries around the world, one of the things that you might see, especially in older monasteries, is a very, very large bell tower. And the bell tower serves as a very important part of the community's life because when the bell tolls, it often is tolling to bring all of the community to prayer. And when the bell tolls, the bell toller, the bell ringer, needs to be able to have an idea as to what the day is going to look like. Well, the abbot or prioress, as St Benedict says, is in charge of making sure that people know when the hours of prayer are going to be, because this is a time before alarm clocks, this is a time before our precision, as it comes to timeliness, even becomes a cultural thing. In fact, just as a small example, the culture around the United States as it comes to time is significantly different, and in fact is a marker of our cultural Americanness, our United Statesianness, because whenever you go outside of the United States, especially to Central and South America, the cultural relationship to time is significantly different. Timeliness for us in the United States, for someone who lives in Central and South America, is simply not a virtue, so to speak. Timeliness, being on time to something, in other words, being there before something starts 15 minutes early, or being there right on time for things to happen, is in fact just as much a cultural thing for us in the United States as it is for anyone else. And so when we think about timeliness, particularly when we think about 5th century timeliness, this is not merely a set your alarm clocks for a specific precise time. Instead, this is something that is dynamic with the changing of the seasons, and something that needs to be clearly communicated from the abbot and prioress to the community and for those who are calling the community to prayer. But at the same time, there are those who are going to be in charge of certain aspects of the prayer. There are those who will be charged with the singing of the psalm, the reading of the lessons, and those who are going to be doing so need to be prepared for those things, because just as it is a discipline for us to get up at the toll of the bell and go pray, it is also a discipline for us to be prepared to go and pray. Again, we all are returning to this whole concept in Benedictine spirituality of attentiveness. You cannot go through life inattentively, and insofar as you do so, you are doing your own soul a disservice. We are numbing ourselves to the reality of the world rather than participating in the reality of the world. And Benedict does not want that to be the case, and instead wants us to attentively and seriously enter into this time as a real discipline. And in that real discipline, and in that, as Sister Joan might put it, this artistic expression of the prayers, the singing of the psalms, the reading of the lessons, the silence at the times appropriate, is a way that begins to train the community in the virtues of the discipline of a holy life. And it's hard to do that if you don't know what time you need to get up, if you don't have an attentiveness during the time, and if you're not prepared to enter into that time as an actual encounter with God. Rather, there is a significant amount of preparation that is needing to be made in order for even the simplest hour to be observed. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the community members should have specified periods for manual labor as well as for prayerful reading. We believe that the times for both may be arranged as follows. From Easter to the 1st of October, they will spend their mornings after prime. Try that again. From Easter to the 1st of October, they will spend their mornings after prime until the 4th hour at whatever work needs to be done. From the 4th hour until the time of Sext, they will devote themselves to reading, but after Sext and their meal, they may rest on their beds in complete silence. Should any members wish to read privately, let them do so, but without disturbing others. They should say none a little early, about midway through the 8th hour, and then until Vespers they are to return to whatever work is necessary. They must not become distressed if local conditions or their poverty should force them to do the harvesting themselves. When they live by the labor of their hands, as our ancestors and the apostles did, then they are really monastics. Yet all things are to be done with moderation on account of the faint-hearted. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. That might seem all well and good for us at the very beginning of that sentence. It is very much the case that us in our American culture are rarely idle. And the workaholism that is so closely associated with our vocational identities here in the United States is one that perhaps could lend itself to a particular reading of not being idle. But then when you read the rest of that section, you begin to very clearly understand that for Benedict, idleness is not the same thing as not working. Idleness is not the same thing as simply laziness. We might equate idleness with laziness, and that is not either of what Benedict is talking about. To be idle is to not have specified times for work and for reading. Now, this is a very interesting juxtaposition of this, because when you start reading about the hours of which are being kept in this, you begin to all of a sudden be opened up to a completely, dare I say, countercultural way of understanding how to live a good day. Because Benedict, when he talks about not being idle, does not mean that we have to work all day. Rather, the work that we do is both physical necessities, but also is deeply spiritual in nature. If you kind of break down the hours that he was talking about in that first section, roughly what he's talking about, and again, we need to be careful about treating the hours, because the hours is not a reference to a particular time on the clock, so to speak. The hours that are listed are simply the hours of which the monastics are going to be at work. So that when we talk about the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, it's not meaning 3 a.m., 6 a.m., and 9 a.m. And 9 a.m. It's actually meaning a lot closer to about 9 a.m. to noon to 3 p.m. Those are about where you could expect the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours during the day. But even with that adjustment, notice that a significant portion of the day is spent in balance. Balance between work, rest, study. All of these things, work and rest and study and prayer, are held in a balanced life, not an imbalanced life. Benedict does not have the 9-to-5 job description that we have here in our United States culture. Instead, what he says very specifically, when you get done with the early morning prayers, you are to study quietly, so not to disturb others or to rest upon your bed in silence. You are to give yourself over to actual reading of books, studying of material, enhancing the mind. Periods specifically set apart for that. And not only is it this way, but did you notice there are 3 hours set aside for personal reading? Goodness gracious, I would move to a Benedictine monastery right now. if that was simply the case for the everyday experience. But it should kind of strike you as the fact that, like, Benedict has such a different conception of what it means to work. Because he says there should be appropriate times to work. There are things that have to get done around the monastery, but work is not the point of it. Work is to be around the same sort of practice and discipline as the spiritual life, yes. But work is a completely different conception in the Benedictine monastery. Work is something that needs to be counterbalanced by personal growth in the prayers, in reading, in rest, so that we can do the work that we need to in an effective manner. The work, quote unquote, the work that goes on in the monastery is stuff that lasts for 5 to 6 hours of the day, but is counterbalanced by those other hours of the day that are specifically set up for a balanced way of living life during the day. One cannot be spiritually fed if one is too fatigued to stay awake during prayers. Benedict knows that. And in other words, everything around the monastery is for the purpose of the building of the soul. And that is what is meant to be the way that the community functions, so that one grows into the stature of Christ and one is not crushed by their responsibilities. As we read on in this particular chapter, you will once again over and over be struck by, and maybe even sensitized to, how our American culture of work is indeed a cultural thing and not necessarily a marker of our superiority to the rest of the world. When it comes to the areas of spiritual and mental health, and especially as we may take a look at our culture and ask ourselves, are people really spiritually fed by the way that we have set up the workday? We might increasingly look askance at the way that our culture valorizes overwork and valorizes those who work for exorbitant amount of hours such that they don't have time for their families or times for their communities, or dare I say even times to themselves. And whenever we take a look at people who are so given over to workaholism, and I say this as someone myself who is given over to this a lot, but when we start looking at those things, we begin to maybe have a different question in our minds as to, man, are we really living balanced spiritual lives? Or is the culture surrounding this simply crushing people? From the 1st of October to the beginning of Lent, the members ought to devote themselves to reading until the end of the 2nd hour. At this time, terce is to be said, and they are to work at their assigned tasks until none. At the first signal for the hour of none, all put aside their work to be ready for the second signal. Then after their meal, they will devote themselves to their reading or to the Psalms. During the days of Lent, they should be free in the morning to read until the 3rd hour, after which they will work at their assigned tasks until the end of the 10th hour. During this time of Lent, each one is to receive a book from the library and is to read the whole of it straight through. These books are to be distributed at the beginning of Lent. Above all, 1 or 2 elders must surely be deputed to make the rounds of the monastery while the members are reading. Their duty is to see that no one is so apathetic as to waste time or engage in idle talk to the neglect of their reading, and so not only harm themselves, but also distract others. If such persons are found, God forbid, they should be reproved a 1st and 2nd time. If they do not amend, they must be subjected to the punishment of the rule as a warning to others. Further, members ought not to associate with one another at inappropriate times. On Sunday, all are to be engaged in reading, except those who have been assigned various duties. If any are so remiss and indolent that they are unwilling or unable to study or to read, they are to be given some work in order that they may not be idle. Those who are sick or weak should be given a type of work or craft that will keep them busy without overwhelming them or driving them away. The prioress or abbot must take their infirmities into account. Sister Joan sums this up very well. Work is not the aim of the Benedictine. God is the aim of the Benedictine. Work is not the badge of honor that one wears around to show how much one has accomplished. That's not how we measure ourselves, nor is it safe to measure ourselves that way in Benedict's mind. Rather, the search for God is what needs to define us as Benedictines. And to read through what he says needs to be done for certain times of the season, such as being given a book to read all the way through, it should be understood that study is a part of that work. Even though our United States culture might look at that and say, what is he doing assigning reading instead of work? Now, any students who are tuning in with us right now, or those who are professional teachers and things like that, will know that reading is work. Study is hard work. It's not something that you get to go do because you are a student or because you're not ready for the workforce. That is a cultural divide. Rather, study is part of the work. That is something that is meant to enliven the mind to the possibility that God is speaking through the things that we study. And during Lent, it is in fact an extended study time. It's a time for particularly applying our minds to work. But there is, once again, as Benedict is wont to do, an exception for those who begin to give themselves over to idleness, which is to failure to study or to be distracted, things like that. It should be noted, Benedict makes a very clear distinction between those who are simply idle, those who are simply troublemakers, so to speak, or given over to talking or idle talk, and those who just have difficulty reading and staying focused. It should be noted that Benedict actually says that if monastics have difficulty with this, they should be given work so as not to be given over to idleness. Well, guess what? There are people in the world in which study is to be done in small portions. There are those in the world that cannot do extended studies for long periods of time. And guess what? That's okay. What Benedict says is that they should be given work appropriate so that they are not left idle. There are those in the world who just need something to do. And that's not at its very face a character deficiency. That should not be the case, that we think about those who simply need something to do as having a character deficiency. It honestly might be a manifestation of a gift for the community, that they simply are those who are given to work as a particularly spiritual task. Now, again, giving over to labor and things like that is not to be done in imbalance to study and reflection, but there are those who are perhaps more tipping the scales towards one or the other. And that this is not a deficiency, but rather needs to be taken in stride. There needs to be exceptions made for those who just struggle in this case. And that is also Benedict's look at those who are infirm. And it is the case in which Benedict says that those who are infirm should not be excluded from the work or study of the community, but rather that their work or study should be appropriate to what they can do. There was a beautiful picture that Sister Joan kind of brings up at the end of this section, which is when you see an old grandmother planting flowers, or an old person who is mowing the lawn, or someone who is crippled in one of their legs shuffling over to their office desk, that all of these people are serving not only just work needs of the community, but essential needs of the community. That they are doing the work in the capacity in which they can. One who has a crippled leg or who needs to be wheelchair bound is not someone who can't do necessary and essential work, and should not be excluded from those who are doing the helpful work of the community, but rather should be given appropriate work that they are able to do. The life of a monastic ought to be a continuous Lent. Since few, however, have the strength for this, we urge the entire community during these days of Lent to keep its manner of life most pure and to wash away, in this holy season, the negligences of other times. This we can do in a fitting manner by refusing to indulge evil habits and by devoting ourselves to prayer with tears, to reading, to compunction of heart, and self-denial. During these days, therefore, we will add to the usual measure of our service something by way of private prayer and abstinence from food or drink, so that each of us will have something above the assigned measure to offer God of our own will with the joy of the Holy Spirit. In other words, let each one deny themselves some food, drink, sleep, needless talking, and idle jesting, and look forward to Holy Easter with joy and spiritual longing. All should, however, make known to the prioress or abbot what they intend to do, since it ought to be done with their prayer and approval. Whatever is undertaken without the permission of the prioress or abbot will be reckoned as presumption and vainglory, not deserving a reward. Therefore, everything must be done with their approval. Lent, in the liturgical calendar of the Church, is the period of time of 40 days prior to the celebration of Easter, when there is a particularly austere focus on sin, forgiveness, repentance, and preparation of ourselves in order that we might celebrate a good Easter. The ways in which we enter into Lent are ways that we have to self-discipline ourselves in a more, perhaps, attentive manner, and to also take on disciplines that will serve for the good order of our own spiritual lives before God, so that we might drive out all of those negligences and those idle practices that might distract us from the reason for what we're practicing. In this way, Lent for St Benedict, and likewise for the rest of the Church, is a time of discipline and preparation. This, in fact, by the way, historically, is when those who would want to become Christians were prepared to be baptized at Easter. So it was a particularly important time for Christian communities to prepare those who were becoming members. But in the monastic community, a Lent observed is one in which does require some additional disciplines, some additional fastings, some withholding of some joyous activity for the purposes of focusing austerely on our sin, on the forgiveness of our sin, and on the discipline of living humble and repentant lives. And in that, I think that there is a really helpful suggestion that Benedict gives in perhaps our modern day audience, is that no discipline is to be undertaken without actually saying what you're going to do to the abbot and prioress. For the monastic community, this is an absolute requirement, because if you simply just do whatever your own whims are and not tell anybody what you're doing, then it gives us over to control. It gives us over to perhaps look and see what I'm doing, because what I am doing is what I am doing for Christ. But the abbot and prioress and their input has the helpful way of being a counterbalance to this. A monastic might come with a practice that is absolutely inappropriate, maybe not just for themselves, but for the entire community. And the abbot or prioress can actually say, no, that's not an appropriate practice. They can be a check and balance on our individual whims and actually point us in a more appropriate direction. And when it happens that way, we have to be careful about taking on disciplines for Lent that are simply serving our own interior needs, but rather we need to subject those needs, those whims, to what the abbot and prioress directs us towards. There needs to be a give and take between what we believe is the appropriate discipline, because not all discipline is helpful for us personally or for the community, And likewise, not all discipline that we might think is a good idea is actually a good idea. Members who work so far away that they cannot return to the oratory at the proper time, and the prioress or abbot determines that is the case, are to perform the Opus Dei where they are and kneel out of reverence for God. So too, those who have been sent on a journey are not to omit the prescribed hours, but are to observe them as best as they can, not neglecting their measure of service. Once again, the Benedictine sensibility comes to there have to be ways in which the exceptions of the community life can be taken into account in a healthy manner. Take, for example, during harvest season, if you are way, way, way out in the fields, and there is perhaps not a way in which you can make it back to the prayers of the community without causing a little bit of a commotion, or honestly, without being able to observe the service at all. And Benedict says there are cases where this is exactly the reality. And instead of saying that those tasks don't need to happen, the harvest needs to happen, Benedict says, let them observe the prayer hours where they're at. And like should be said, the prayers of the faithful are not merely those things that we grab out our texts and open them. Remember, this is a time in the 500s where the Bible was learned, was memorized, not merely recited from a book that they had in their pockets. In fact, it was rarely the case that communities had all of the portions of the Bible that we might have readily available on our cell phones today. There was no such thing as having a Bible on you at all times, but rather the Bible had to be within you. And so the appropriate recitation of the hours should be done at an appropriate manner where you're at if it precludes you being able to make it back. And that is a sensible thing for Benedictines to be able to say. There are times when long journeys are needed for the community, such as going to a far-off city for business for the monastery. That's not in any way unsensible, but rather it is still subject to the discipline of the community because they're still praying at the appropriate hours that their community is praying. If, for good reason, you are prevented from being able to say the hours, you should say the hours on your own. This should not be the normative sense of that, Benedict makes very clear, but it should be an allowance, because everyone has different times and responsibilities in their lives. If members are sent on some errand and expect to return to the monastery that same day, they must not presume to eat outside, even if they receive a pressing invitation, unless perhaps the prioress or abbot has ordered it. Should they act otherwise, they will be excommunicated. Would we go on vacation? There is a common practice, especially within the United States, that, when you go on vacation, it seems that it is a vacation for the purposes of just getting out of town and leaving all of those responsibilities behind. I can tell of all kinds of things that go off of my plate whenever we are able to just get away from the house for a few days. Whenever you come home, there are always those responsibilities that you think of. The dishes need to be done, the toys need to get picked up for you who are parents, things need to get cleaned, the cars need to be taken care of, all of the various things that pile up on our responsibilities that we, in our vacations, simply can just leave alone and go out somewhere else. But for Benedict, one of the things that he cautions very, very harshly about is that for those who are members of the community who need to go out on short errands, that their discipline in the community does not stop once they leave the bounds of the monastery. They don't become non-Benedictines when they leave the confines of those walls. And likewise, their discipline is not shirked whenever they go to town. And that should be the case as it comes to simple things like perhaps temptation to eat a big meal or things like that, to get away with eating an exorbitant amount whenever you leave the monastery, or to participate in otherwise undisciplined activities. And this, it might seem to us as being a little overarching or overreaching by Benedict, but if you think about what exactly he's trying to say about this, what he's really communicating is that when you leave the bounds of the walls, you cannot simply leave behind whom you are becoming. You cannot leave behind the cowl and the hood and the Benedictine life of which you are now bound to. I think that if we maybe move that metaphor a little bit, it might help us get a sense as to what Benedict might be saying. When we come to worship as Christians on Sunday, when we leave the bounds of the church building, when we leave the bounds of the liturgy, we are not released from our Christian responsibility and discipline to the world. When we go to church on Sunday and then live life as if we are not Christian the rest of the week, Benedict says you have not become anything other than simply what you desire to be. And that, in a lot of ways, is that we want the outward trappings of spirituality, but we don't want the hard work of becoming someone different. Or, to put it in the Pauline way, we are not willing to die to ourselves in order to be raised with Christ. Instead, we are meant to, in the same way that we enter the liturgy on Sunday, to live our lives in accordance and parallel with that discipline the rest of the week. Whenever we say the confession and rise for the absolution, when we are dismissed to go in the name of Christ, such as the case with our liturgy here at Trinity Episcopal Church, we are never given a shirking of responsibility, and we are never given a free pass for, now that I've gone to church, I can do whatever I want during the week. That's not how Christian discipline works. And likewise, that's not how any discipline works. And especially for the Benedictine, when we are practicing this disciplined life of driving out sin, of a little strictness for the purposes of building charity, we can't simply leave that as we leave the bounds of the doorway. Instead, that's something that has to come with us, because it is a transformation of the ways in which we are following Christ. And it is for that purpose that we have to live transformed lives whenever we go into the world, as well as when we come to prayer and worship and work in the bounds of the community.